Good evening and welcome back to our special CMI Women series in the Better Managers Manual, where we're discussing each theme in detail each week. And this week is no different. We'll be looking at the new good governance connecting with society. As usual, we're going to be taking questions from our CMI Women members in the Facebook group, and also dipping into questions and comments on LinkedIn Live. So thank you for joining us this evening. Please do use the action emojis and comment and add your questions as we go through the event. It's really great to make sure we're answering questions that you are most concerned about. So, apologies if there are, I've already had a comment, apologies if there are technical issues, we'll try and resolve those as we go through the event. So, to begin with, I'd like to introduce my guest this week. It's CMI companion Shonaig Macpherson. Shonaig holds a number of non-exec roles in third and public sectors, most recently appointed as the president of the Scottish Council for Development and Industry, and Shonaig is also currently chair of the Robertson Trust and the Royal Lyceum Theatre Company. So I'm really pleased that Shonaig is here to join us this evening, although I am hearing that there's rather poor sound quality at the moment, so I am just going to try and resolve that very quickly. And apologies for everybody who's waiting on the line. And Shonaig, good evening, as we try and resolve that. So hopefully the magic of some headphones has made the audio much better for everybody that is watching. If Heather says it's much better, so if everybody else can hear me nicely, and Mohammed has confirmed that the audio is much better. So apologies for that slightly shaky start, but we're really excited that Shonaig is here to join us to talk about good governance and connecting with society. So to set the scene somewhat, in our April 2020 Managers' Voice survey, we found that 88% of managers said their organisation had put business continuity arrangements in place, but 5% said their organisation had business continuity management arrangements and that they have not been implemented, and 3% did not have business continuity planning arrangements. So, Shonaig, what's your thoughts on those findings?
They're very interesting. What I'm seeing is that while business continuity plans were in place, certainly the organisations that I'm involved with, we had not contemplated a global health pandemic. The Robertson Trust, we had a business continuity plan for if our building had burned down, and that meant we moved to another building. Of course, no longer possible. And similarly, chairing a theatre company, we didn't have anything other than a fire where we thought we would not be able to run our business for potentially 18, 24 months. So I think all of us are going to have to really go back and look at the risks to our organisations and be prepared to constantly update them and take into account macro events in a way we've never done before.
That's really interesting. And another one of the interesting findings from our research, in the same survey, we found that 67% of managers stated that their organisations were taking action to support corporate social responsibility in relation to COVID. So, Shonaig, do you think that represents a permanent step change?
I hope so, but I think one of the things that we've got to be realistic about is some people have reacted very quickly to support their staff and their communities. And I hope that what will happen is, as we begin to come into a recovery phase, that organisations will look more strategically about what they do to support their local communities. The thing that I've been most heartened by have been the number of people who have volunteered to support the National Health Service or organisations such as the Red Cross, the Trussell Trust food banks. And I hope that that willingness to support local communities can be captured, and maybe people in their workplaces will encourage their employers to think more strategically about how they do have long-term engagement with communities rather than on a project-by-project basis, which tends to be the norm at the moment.
That's really interesting. So kind of long-term strategic thinking is one part of this. What else
Yeah.
have we learned from the crisis about good governance?
I think we've learned a great deal, and I think mainly from those organisations that appear to be more resilient about it. If you think about good governance, it's all about direction setting, how decisions are made, how they're implemented, how they're monitored, and how they reinform your strategic purpose. And I think for me, what I've seen is the importance of being able to make decisions in the context of your overall purpose and your values. I think it's been great to see the number of organisations who say that their people are their best asset, who have really done that and have gone to great lengths to care for their staff during this crisis. I think that in decision making itself, being prepared and comfortable with uncertainty, being prepared to make decisions without perfect information. Actually deciding not to make a decision is making a decision itself, which people don't often think about that. I think for boards that I work with is that moving into an active support role rather than purely oversight. At the organisations I'm involved with, we set up very quickly a coronavirus response committee made up of board members and executive members that meets weekly to check that we're on track to be available for support. I think it's then getting out of the way. I think the other thing that's been really important is engagement with your stakeholders and transparency in your decision making, explaining what decisions you've made, why you've made them, and communicating them clearly. I think that's been really important. I think the importance of learning, I'm seeing that organisations that have learning at the heart of their DNA, they seem to be more resilient and able to respond more effectively. And I think for boards, I think in the future it'd be interesting to see where boards spend their time. Many boards spend a lot of their time on what I call rear view mirror, which is the accountability piece. They're always looking backwards, and then perhaps haven't been spending as much time looking forward to ensure that the organisation is resilient, that its stakeholders are resilient and able to be sustainable in the medium and longer term. And I think one of the issues as well that will come out of it is on time, is particularly as a non-exec, how many non-exec directorships can you really hold at any one time when you're having to deal with a crisis on this scale?
That's really interesting, and obviously a lot of the focus there has been on what organisations can do perhaps inwardly. So what might managers and leaders, or how best could managers and leaders consider the social impact of their decisions during the efforts to return to work and rebuild?
I think the starting point has to be the organisation's own staff, and really being very honest and looking at how your staff work, how they're paid, what their contracts are, how they get to work, how they don't get to work, working practices, working hours. That has an impact. That's the most direct impact you have as an employer is your staff and on your community. So I think engaging with staff in a completely different way. I hope to see more people who are prepared to involve staff in decision-making processes. One thing I've done recently at the Robertson Trust is that we spend 20 million a year on charitable grants in Scotland, and we involved every single member of staff and every current grant holder in our strategy renewal process to take their views into account. I think as well on social impact, if you're setting standards for yourself where you're paying living wage, all of the good socially responsible organisations, are you asking difficult questions of your supply chain? Are they also taking account of their impact on their community, on the environment? Similarly with some of your customers, are you content with the way that some of your customers are behaving as well? So I think concentrating on all of those, and then again, engaging in your community. and seeing where you can really make a difference in your community, I think is going to be really, really very important going forward.
And just as a reminder to everybody watching, our CMI Women members on Facebook and everyone watching on LinkedIn, do submit your questions, and we'll try and factor those in the next 20 minutes or so. But before we move on to those, how can we better collaborate to ensure good governance, and what else needs to happen?
I think the first step is being very self-aware about the governance in your own organisation and taking the lessons that we've all learned from how we've responded to this crisis and being prepared to make changes ourselves. I think it's reaching out to others and learning from them, and probably actually looking cross-industry and cross-sectorally to look at the different approaches that others have taken during this crisis to learn from them. Building different types of partnerships, being prepared to speak about what worked and what didn't work. I think quite often organisations are very concerned that if they say they've got something wrong, that bounces back on them. But if they say how they responded to what went wrong, I think it's actually a strength. I think we need to do more of that. I mean, I can give an example again from the Robertson Trust. We're quite unusual in that we own a very large international premium spirits business called Edrington, which manufactures Famous Grouse and the Macallan, and which is quite an odd relationship. But we talk to them all the time about what they're doing in terms of their business, so that we can think about what we're doing. And similarly, when we were going through our strategic process, we talked to them about why we were doing it, and just trying to learn from different people about the best way to do things. And I think there's an awful lot that can be learned from the third sector, because charities actually have the charity trustees have a higher standard of care than company directors. And that, so there's different lots of different approaches. And I think being prepared to talk across sector to learn will be really important.
Okay, and that's really interesting. And I think we've had a question come through which touches upon that, especially in terms of supply chain. But just before, well, actually, let's go straight to that. So Phil Oldfield has said risk management has got to be a part of the board's remit, not just within organisation, but equally across their supply chain. Managers can no longer raise a risk and admire it, but must make positive adjustments in their decision making to address the risk to the organisation. So asking for your thoughts on that in the supply chain context.
Yeah, I think one of the things that this pandemic has illustrated in the most horrific fashion is the interconnectedness and how risk is amplified through supply chains. And that if you need to be a successful business, you need to be, you have to have resilient supply chains. And we've seen awful consequences of not having resilient supply chains in the United Kingdom, particularly in PPE. And what I certainly see from my colleagues at Edrington is that malt is a very important ingredient in whiskey, as is water. And therefore, the risks that they look at are what's Scottish Water doing in terms of water quality? What's the Speyside River Authority doing around water quality? What are the farmers where our crops are grown doing in terms of their risks? What do we do in terms of risks around distribution and transport? So yes, I think we have to see that risk breaks through the walls of our organizations, and we have to be confident that anyone that we're partnering with in business has identified the risks. And I think it's the sort of conversations that will now happen when long-term contracts are being put in place, is maybe some of the information that we will now ask our partners to supply is much more around their own risk management framework, their risk appetite, and how we can share risks across organizations.
That's fascinating. And well, to pick up on perhaps one of the two things there. So obviously you mentioned there around water and soil and these types of environmental issues. What do you think the crisis has done to environmental issues for boards? Has it raised the importance? Has it lowered the importance? Has it had no impact?
I think it's had an impact, but I'm going to answer it on the basis of what this crisis has done is it's brought into stark relief the inequitable inequalities there are not only in the United Kingdom but around the world. And climate change is going to have a far greater impact on the most disadvantaged than those of us who are not. And I think that if there is now a genuine wish to, in the words of the Prime Minister, level up and begin to address some of those inequalities, climate change is a key part of that. If we look at fuel poverty in the UK, if we look at water shortages in the developing world, I do think it is going to become much more important. I think as well, the speed at which the pandemic arose will ironically make people begin to think, right, we do actually need to do something about climate change now. So I don't think it's pushed it off the agenda. I think it's brought it right back onto the agenda, but through a very different lens. And I think that lens is inequality.
That's really interesting, and I know we'll go on to discuss this a little more. Again, just a final or another call to our watchers this evening to post any questions and comments that you have so far. In the meantime, Shonaig, I'm interested about the comment you made there on levelling up, and obviously you are situated within the Scottish context, and earlier you talked about learning from one another, and there have been differences. So, from your perspective, what's the knowledge exchange that should be happening there between Scotland and other devolved nations and regions potentially as well?
Yeah. Well, one of the I play is I'm the UK government's lead non-exec director in Scotland. So there's a huge amount of knowledge exchange that actually happens. But one of the things is that, and you see it in England, Scotland has got a very different demographic to Scotland. We've got a much higher proportion of an aging population. I think there's 5 65-year-olds for every 16-year-old as a stat. So there are different issues. We've got sort of 1/8 of the population and 1/3 of the landmass, with lots of rural communities. If you look at somewhere like the Highlands, there's only one intensive care unit in something like 400 square miles. I mean, it's extraordinary. So I think there were bound to be differences. Where I think there has been good shared learning is around the science. But politicians do what politicians do, and they will interpret it differently. But I think behind the scenes there has been good learning.
Thank you. That's very interesting. And we have had another question come through, and that's from Ali, sorry, and that's what are your thoughts about engaging the workforce and lifting their morale? So I know you've touched on this earlier, but do you have, and it leads into your kind of expert tips, sorry, I should say, that we'll be discussing in a moment.
Yeah, I think it's been really important during this crisis to be authentic and true to yourself in this crisis, in that sharing with all of your colleagues that this is frightening for all of us. I think that in this situation, if you don't have that empathy, it's going to be more difficult to motivate and retain your staff. And one of the things I found quite interesting is living in this virtual world is that quite a lot of people are saying, I'm actually seeing I'm seeing and speaking more to my manager than I ever did in the world before COVID. And they're very keen to retain that. So I think it's all about authenticity. I think it's actually being prepared to say, I've never lived through anything like this before, so I don't know all of the answers. But what I will do is I'll share with you what I'm thinking. I will ask you for your view and what you think we should do. And I'll tell you when I'm going to make my decision, what the decision is, why I've made it. So I think it's about being really, really honest and not pretending that you have a magic map to navigate the way through the crisis.
That's really interesting. And as part of this series, we've discussed a number of issues. So in the first, we talked about flexibility and the impact of a widespread move to flexible working with Elizabeth Pears from BuzzFeed News UK. And we talked about how the crisis has been experienced differently by different people and different groups. And obviously you mentioned earlier aging population being one of them, people perhaps with disability and long-term health issues or concerns being another. And we did have a question pre-submitted this evening as well, which is asking about the recent statistics and report showing that the BAME community has been hit the worst in the UK. And it's a difficult discussion to have. And this evening's event is on the topic of new good governance. And we've been discussing how diverse leadership leads to better outcomes. And I know you've got some further thoughts on that, Shonaig. But to answer this question, I actually took some of your advice that you've just given and spoke earlier with a chartered companion, Pavita Cooper, who led CMI work on establishing CMI Race and the reports with the British Academy of Management on delivering diversity, which will be rebooting that conversation very shortly. And Pavita said, it's our collective responsibility to listen, learn, educate, and take action, to be active allies, to never be bystanders against any act of exclusion. Good governance is about having processes that eliminate bias and discrimination, but given the subjective nature of racism, also to have the practices that allow reporting, escalation, and corrective action. So those words from Pavita Cooper, one of our other charter companions. But I know earlier you wanted to talk a little more on diverse leadership in general. So, you know, what are your thoughts on how the crisis might shape diverse leadership going forward?
I hope that we will see many more diverse leaders, and I in that we have to be open to talent wherever we find it. I mean, I thought Perdita's comment there was excellent, absolutely spot on. And I think, you know, one of the really, really important things is around diverse thinking. And you need people from diverse backgrounds to really, really help you with that. And I see that particularly in the work I do with the Robertson Trust, where in the world of charities, you hear people speak a great deal about lived experience. So how can you really sort of try to help eradicate poverty unless you have somebody on your board who has lived experience, who really understands what's involved in all of that? So I do think it's really important, because for me, an aspect of diversity that's often not spoken about is diverse thinking. I've been on boards where, because people have all been drawn from a similar background, you default into groupthink. And I think one of the most powerful things is having people from different and diverse backgrounds, so that you have that diversity of thought, so that you are making decisions with a 360-degree input from different voices. And I think it's vitally, vitally important that we continue with that. I think good progress has been made. If you look at the progress that the 30% Club has made on having women on the boards of FTSEs, that's great. And I hope that where people can make their voice heard, they should make it heard.
Absolutely fantastic, Shonaig. And I know we've only got a few minutes left of the event this evening. So if anyone has any burning comments or questions to ask Shonaig, then please do post them now. But while they do that, Shonaig, can I just ask, you know, what are your expert top tips for leaders and their boards right now?
I think it is not being frightened of uncertainty. I think it is being very true to your values. If you have got them posted on your wall. It's much more important that at this time you live them, because people will remember the decisions you've made, and they will be as interested in how you made them as those decisions. So I think it's being true to your strategic objectives, to your values, good engagement, constant communication with your stakeholders, I think is true. And I think being authentic, as I said earlier, at the end, we're all human beings, and this is affecting us all differently, and there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's a positive good to admit that we're all having to find our way through this.
Absolutely, and the Better Managers Manual itself states exactly that, to the importance of managing with a human face. And we've had a comment from Abimbola agreeing with you that diverse thinking is absolutely essential. And we've also had a question come through from Carol asking, how would you prepare a company for the return of the workforce beside the social distancing policies and staggered breaks? So are there any other recommendations? So perhaps at a slightly zoomed out level, how would you be preparing a company or an organization for the return to work?
Well, I'm doing it right now at the Robertson Trust, in that I decided it wasn't for me to assume what was right. So we have gone out with a confidential questionnaire for all of our staff to send back to a third party about what they're looking forward to, what they want to retain from this new world, what they want to stop, what they want to restart, and what are their concerns. And once I've got that data, we'll then feed back what we've heard collectively and find a way to return. In that, I think in this time when there is still that health risk, we need to listen to our staff about what's going to be there. And you also need to do the same with your customers. What are customers going to do? I mean, I see it with my theatre. It's going to be a very long time until the demographic that comes to my theatre, which is my age and older, in that, sitting in the dark close to strangers for 2.5 hours is not something people are going to return to quite quickly. So we're going to have to constantly speak to them about when they're comfortable, what they want to do, and what they expect. So I think, it's about engaging with your staff and your customers and your stakeholders. And once you've got that data, then plan for it.
That's really interesting. And in terms of engaging with your staff, so again, we had an event last week on happiness at work with a CCMI Women board member, Dr. Jumia Koya. And we were talking through some recent research that we did with Engaging Works on happiness at work, which showed that between January and April, people seemed happier. And we kind of discussed why that might be and so on. But I think at the kind of leadership level, when thinking through the engagement with staff, how important is it to consider equality and diversity issues there? For example, there is some literature that shows that women are perhaps less decisive in the responses they give in surveys. Is that something that you take into account and factor into the types of questions you ask, for example?
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that we've done in this survey is there's a lot of free text boxes in that, again, you can't assume you know. We're in a situation where we quite often don't know the questions we should be asking. So actually giving people the ability to comment on their own, I think is an important thing to do right now. And recognise everybody's different.
Absolutely. So, I've certainly learned a lot this evening and talked about engaging and authenticity, really, being two main takeaways that certainly have been impactful for me as a manager. I know, there will be people who are kind of interested in reading on this topic further. So I wondered if you had a couple of recommendations or a recommendation at all.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in Managing Direct. There's some great tips and things in there. But one thing that I would recommend, and I think it is on CMI's Management Book of the Year shortlist, is on diverse thinking. And that is Matthew Syed's book on Rebel Ideas, which is full of some great stories of how diverse approaches and diverse thinking has had some phenomenal successes across all sorts of different sectors, and it's a really great read. So I'd recommend that very highly.
Fantastic, thank you ever so much. And that brings us, I mean, very neatly to the end of our conversation. I'll just outline a little bit of what we have coming up, but thank you ever so much, Shonaig, and for everybody, your questions, your comments, and again, you know, please do react and give us an emoji to show how you found the event. Next week will actually be the last in this series on the Better Managers Manual CMI Women. And we'll be looking at Obstacle to Opportunity, the new employment landscape. And I'll be joined by Renee Raper and Thelma Ford Escobar from CMI Scotland and CMI Northeast Yorkshire and Humberside networks, respectively. And they'll be sharing their expertise on handling tough conversations and also taking control of your own career journey. And then this Friday, again, our CEO will be joined in conversation by two more chartered companions, Vanessa Vallely and John Jeffcock, and they're going to provide expert advice on how to digitize your business during this crisis. So that's one to watch on Friday lunchtime. And as usual, we always have podcasts to accompany your daily exercise, of which now is an unlimited amount that you can be taking during the day. And also for our CMI Women members, do take a look at the resources that Shonaig mentioned on Management Direct. There's lots on there on governance in particular. And obviously the Management of Book of the Year shortlist as well. And for those watching on LinkedIn, thank you ever so much for your comments and interaction this morning. It's great, this evening, sorry. It's great you could join us. And do consider visiting the CMI Women website for more information. And you can also join as a CMI Women member as well. So that just leaves me to say thank you ever so much, Shonaig. We're having some great comments come through. So everyone seems to have enjoyed the evening. And I really appreciate you taking your time to speak to us on good governance, or the new good governance. So thank you ever so much.
No, thank you.
And good evening, everybody.